In the quiet village of Kibara, life went on slowly. Children ran through the dusty streets, women carried baskets of fruit on their heads, and men worked in the fields from morning until evening. The village was peaceful most of the time, but that peace was broken the day Amara disappeared. She was known in Kibara as a brave and clever young woman. People admired her because she was kind, smart, and always ready to help others. She worked in her small garden near her mother's house and sometimes helped neighbors with small tasks. She was gentle but strong, the kind of person who could solve problems calmly and quickly. That afternoon, as Amara walked home from the market with a basket of vegetables, she felt a strange presence behind her. At first, she thought it was just someone following her for a favor or a small request. But then she heard a voice, low and harsh. "You are coming with me." Before she could react, a large hand grabbed her arm. It was Kofi, a man from a neighboring village. He was known for his anger and his short temper. Many in Kibara whispered that Kofi had a hard life and carried it with him like a weight that made him cruel. But no one expected him to take someone in broad daylight. Amara struggled, twisting and kicking, but Kofi was strong. He pulled her toward the forest path that led out of the village. She shouted for help, but the villagers were too far away and Kofi moved quickly. Her heart pounded, but her mind stayed sharp. She knew panicking could make things worse. As he dragged her through the trees, she studied him carefully. Kofi's face was hard, but his eyes flickered sometimes with doubt or hesitation. She realized that even a man so violent had weaknesses. After a long walk through the forest, Kofi reached a small hut hidden among the tall trees. The hut was simple, made of wood and dried grass, with a tiny door and no windows. Inside it smelled of smoke and damp earth. Amara was shoved inside and Kofi slammed the door behind her. The forest seemed to swallow all sounds of the village. She could hear her own heartbeat, fast and loud. Amara sat down carefully, pretending to be more afraid than she felt. She knew that Kofi wanted her to look weak and helpless, but she could not give him that satisfaction. She looked around the hut. It was small, with only a few tools hanging on the walls and a thin straw mat in one corner. There was a small clay pot in the center and a fire pit that was not lit. She studied every detail, the hinges on the door, the lock, the weak spots in the walls. If she needed to escape, knowing these details would be crucial. Kofi stood near the doorway, watching her carefully. "Do not try anything," he said harshly. "You are here because I said so." Amara nodded slowly, keeping her expression calm. "I will not," she whispered. But in her mind, she was already planning. She observed his movements, the way he held the rope, the moments when he turned his back. She noticed that he was fast but sometimes careless. He had strength, yes, but his anger made him predictable. As night fell, the forest grew dark, and the sounds of animals surrounded the hut. Amara listened carefully to every snap of a branch and every rustle of leaves. She knew that the forest could be dangerous for both of them. Kofi, despite his anger, seemed nervous too. He kept glancing out the small gaps in the walls as if afraid someone might see him. Amara realized that she could use his fear to her advantage. Inside, the hut was quiet except for the soft breathing of Kofi. Amara sat close to the wall, thinking. She remembered all the stories her mother had told her about surviving dangers, about how patience and cleverness could save a person's life. She told herself she could get through this. She didn't need to fight him directly, she needed to wait for the right moment. Every person had a weakness and she was determined to find his. Hours passed slowly. Amara watched as Kofi dozed off in a chair, his head drooping. She noticed the rope hanging loosely from the hook on the wall, and the small gap under the door that could fit her hand through. She smiled slightly, small discoveries, but they gave her hope. She realized that she was not powerless even though she was trapped. The night air was cool, and the smell of the forest mixed with smoke from a small fire Kofi had built outside. Amara used the moments of silence to memorize every sound and shadow. She knew that when morning came, she could use what she had learned. Her mind was already thinking about the villagers, about her family, about the life she wanted to return to. She could not let Kofi's anger control her fate. By morning, the sunlight filtered through the gaps in the hut's walls. Kofi woke up and moved about the room, still tense. Amara kept her eyes down but took note of everything. He ate a small meal and she watched the way he handled his tools. She saw the fear in his eyes when he looked outside the hut. Even though he had kidnapped her, he was not completely fearless. That gave her hope. Amara realized that surviving this day would require patience, observation, and courage. She could not rush, could not act impulsively. Kofi thought he had all the power, but she knew that with careful planning she could turn the situation around. She could find a way to escape without angering him further. She could survive this. As the day wore on, Kofi left the hut briefly to gather water from a small stream nearby. Amara seized the quiet moment to explore her surroundings, carefully touching the walls and door. She measured the gaps and tested the lock lightly, making mental notes of what could work. She was careful not to leave any sign of movement. Every action was deliberate. Every small observation could be the key to her freedom. When Kofi returned, she sat quietly, pretending to have been deep in thought or asleep. He looked at her suspiciously but said nothing. He tightened the rope slightly and moved about the hut again. Amara's heart raced, but she kept calm. She reminded herself that fear was a tool for him, but courage and cleverness were her tools. That night, she lay on the straw mat, staring at the ceiling. Her mind was alive with plans, possibilities, and strategies. She knew this was only the beginning. Being captured was frightening, yes, but it had also awakened something inside her: determination, intelligence, and patience. She would survive and she would find a way to escape. Amara understood something important. Strength was not just physical. It was in knowing when to act, when to wait, and when to observe. Kofi was strong, but she had something stronger: her mind and her courage. She closed her eyes, imagining the village, her family, and her freedom. That vision gave her hope, and hope gave her power. By the end of the first day, Amara had learned much about Kofi and the hut. She knew his routines, his weaknesses, and his fears. She had already begun to plan carefully, without rashness, without panic. She was ready to bide her time, knowing that every moment she observed brought her closer to freedom. Though frightened, she felt a quiet pride. She was not defeated. She had survived the capture so far, and she would continue to survive. The forest outside was dark and mysterious, but inside her mind, everything was clear. She would wait. She would act. And she would be free. Kofi believed that capturing Amara had given him complete power. From the moment he brought her to the small hut deep in the forest, he felt that nothing could go wrong. He had been angry for a long time, angry at the world, at people who had ignored him, at a life that had been hard and unforgiving. Now he thought he could control something. He had taken Amara, a clever and independent woman, away from her peaceful life in Kibara, and for the first time he felt powerful. But the truth was very different. Amara, though captured, was far from helpless. She observed everything. From the moment he left in the mornings to gather wood or fetch water, she noticed patterns in his behavior. She saw the way he moved, the moments he paused, and the small gestures he did without thinking. Each of these details became important. Every night, when he slept, she memorized the positions of objects in the hut, the gaps in the walls, the weak points in the door, and the small window that could serve as an escape route. She realized that Kofi's strength was only on the surface. Beneath it, there were cracks, small openings that she could use to her advantage. At first, Kofi felt satisfied with his control. He would sit near the fire, eating the food he brought or cooked, and watch Amara as she tried to keep calm. He expected fear in her eyes, submission in her posture. But what he saw instead unsettled him. Amara sat quietly, her head held high, her eyes alert. She did not cry, did not beg, and did not plead. She simply observed, with a calm intelligence that made him uneasy. The anger he had felt at the world now began to turn inward. He began asking himself questions he did not want to answer. Why does she not fear me? He thought one night as he stared into the fire. He had expected her to be weak, to be panicked and desperate. Instead, she seemed stronger than he was, in ways he could not understand. He tried to push the thought aside, to remind himself that she was his captive, that she could not leave without his permission. But the calmness in her eyes, the quiet strength she showed every day, made it impossible to ignore. Amara watched him too. She noticed when his hand shook slightly as he tied the ropes, or when he glanced nervously at the gaps in the door while thinking no one was watching. She saw that Kofi was not invincible, that anger had made him predictable. She could feel the fear beneath his fury, the hesitation beneath his harsh words. She used this knowledge to remain composed, to ensure he never suspected she was thinking of a way to escape. The tension between them grew each day. Kofi tried to assert his control by raising his voice, by giving orders, by punishing small mistakes, but nothing seemed to change Amara's calm demeanor. It frustrated him more than anything else. She was clever, yes, but also careful. She followed his rules outwardly while observing and planning inwardly. Every day he tried to dominate her, the more he realized that controlling her was not as simple as he had thought. One evening, Kofi brought food and placed it near her, then sat down opposite her. He watched as she ate slowly, deliberately, and his eyes narrowed. "You are quiet," he said, trying to sound commanding. "Why do you not speak?" Amara looked at him calmly. "I have nothing to say," she replied softly. Her tone was not defiant but measured. Each word seemed to annoy him more, though it was not meant to. She was careful not to challenge him outright, but her composure made him feel powerless in ways he could not understand. As the days passed, Kofi noticed small things that unsettled him further. He realized he had underestimated her. She learned his habits almost immediately: when he slept, when he was careless, when he left his tools within reach. She memorized the position of the ropes, the knots he used, and the times he became distracted. She never acted on these observations yet, but the knowledge itself made him nervous without him realizing why. One morning, as Kofi left to fetch water from a nearby stream, he paused at the door, looking back at her. He did not realize that Amara had already memorized the layout of the hut completely. She had touched the walls, noted the weak spots in the door, and tested the small gaps with her fingers. Each observation was stored in her mind carefully. When he returned, she greeted him calmly, showing no signs that she had been paying attention. But Kofi could sense a change in her. Something in the air seemed different. It was not obvious, but Kofi began to feel restless. The anger and satisfaction he had felt at first was now mixed with unease. Her quiet strength made him question himself in ways he could not admit. He began thinking too much about what she might be planning, about what she might do if given a chance. The confidence he had relied on was slipping. Amara noticed his growing tension. She could see the moments when his eyes darted to the door or when his hands fidgeted slightly. She understood that he was not in complete control, even though he believed he was. She continued to act calm, polite even, never showing fear. The more he saw her composed and thoughtful, the more he realized that capturing her had not made him as powerful as he had imagined. Kofi's frustration grew. He tried to maintain a strict schedule, keeping her under watch constantly, but even that did not bring him peace. He would sit in silence, staring at the walls, thinking about what could happen if she tried something. Even small noises, the rustle of leaves outside or the creak of the hut's roof, made him tense. He had never experienced such uncertainty. Normally he could intimidate people easily, but with Amara, intimidation had little effect. At night, when the fire burned low, he would watch her sleep, half expecting her to move to try to escape. He did not understand why he felt fear. It was not a fear of her strength. He thought he was stronger physically, but a fear of her cleverness, her patience, and her calm intelligence. He realized that someone who did not panic, who did not show weakness, could be a dangerous opponent, even if tied or trapped. Amara, meanwhile, used every moment to study him further. She noticed the way he reacted to small noises, the times he became distracted, and the subtle ways his anger surfaced when he was frustrated. She made mental notes about what would happen if she tried to escape and how she could manipulate these moments. Patience was her greatest tool, and she understood that one wrong move could be fatal. The tension between them grew day by day. Kofi could not rest easily. He began to doubt himself in ways he had never done before. He realized that taking her captive had given him a sense of power, but that power was fragile. Amara had made him aware of his own weaknesses, though she had not even tried to escape yet. He felt uneasy, trapped by his own actions and unsure how to maintain control. Amara understood this tension and used it wisely. She never spoke unless necessary, never moved without purpose, and always remained calm. Her patience frustrated Kofi because he could not break her spirit. The more he tried to dominate her, the more he realized that she was not afraid, that she was thinking, planning, and observing. Even simple acts, like her careful way of sitting or the way she handled her basket of food, unsettled him. He began overthinking, second-guessing himself, and noticing details he had ignored before. Her calmness became a mirror to his insecurity, and every small sign of her confidence chipped away at the false sense of control he had brought into the hut. By the end of the first week, the tension had reached a point where Kofi felt exhausted. He had underestimated the power of a calm, clever mind. Amara's quiet strength had turned the tables in subtle ways. He could not admit it to anyone, not even to himself, but he was no longer certain of his own dominance. Capturing her had given him anger and temporary satisfaction, but it had also brought uncertainty, frustration, and fear. Amara, meanwhile, remained alert, patient, and confident. She knew the hut, knew Kofi's habits, and had already begun forming a plan. But she did not rush. She understood that patience and observation were stronger than rash action. Kofi's restlessness, his growing doubt, and his fear were her allies now. Each day she strengthened her mind and her resolve, ready for the moment when she would act. The forest outside was dark and still at night, but inside the hut, the tension was alive. Kofi sat by the fire, trying to convince himself he was in control, while Amara watched quietly, calculating and learning. For the first time, Kofi realized that capturing someone was not enough. True power required understanding and respect, things he did not have. And Amara, even as a captive, had already begun to claim the upper hand. By the time the sun rose on another day, the roles in the hut had shifted slightly. Kofi still had physical control, but Amara held something he could not see: patience, intelligence, and quiet determination. He was restless, uneasy, and unsure, and she was calm, alert, and confident. The tension between them had changed everything. Amara had been in the small forest hut for several days now, and the tension between her and Kofi had grown in ways neither of them had expected. Kofi thought he had complete control over her, that she would remain silent and fearful, bowing to his anger and strength. But Amara had learned much in the short time she had been there. She had observed his habits, noted his small weaknesses, and memorized every detail of the hut. She understood that direct confrontation would be dangerous, but she also realized that patience and careful communication could shift the balance in her favor. One quiet evening, as Kofi sat by the small fire, sharpening a knife he had brought with him, Amara decided to speak. She had noticed that Kofi often spoke to himself when he thought no one was listening, and she had also seen the moments when he paused as if wishing for something he could not have. Now she used her calm voice to start a simple conversation. "Kofi," she said softly, "why do you do this? Why do you carry so much anger?" Kofi froze, his hand on the knife, unsure how to respond. He had never been asked such a question by anyone, let alone a woman he had taken captive. His eyes narrowed, but Amara continued, speaking slowly, carefully. She told small stories about her life in Kibara, her garden, her friends, her family, the way children ran through the streets laughing and playing. Her stories were simple, but they carried warmth, a sense of life that Kofi had long forgotten existed. At first he was irritated. "Why do you speak to me like this?" he snapped. "You are my captive. You should be quiet and obey." Amara smiled faintly. "I speak because you are human, Kofi. I see the man behind the anger. I see someone who has been hurt and is trying to protect himself. You may not want to hear it, but it is true." Her words struck him in ways he did not understand. No one had ever spoken to him like that. People feared him, obeyed him, or ignored him, but no one had ever looked at him and recognized his pain. He felt a strange sensation, a mixture of fear, respect, and something he could not name. The anger in his chest, which had felt powerful, began to twist into confusion. Amara continued carefully, never forcing the conversation but allowing it to flow naturally. She asked small questions about his childhood, about the forest, about how he survived so long with anger as a companion. Kofi found himself answering, though reluctantly at first. Then, slowly, he began to tell small truths, revealing memories he had hidden even from himself. Each story made him lighter in a way he had never expected. He realized painfully that she was cleverer than he had thought. She was planting seeds of doubt in his mind, showing him glimpses of a life beyond anger and control. Kofi did not know how to react. He wanted to shut her down, to remind himself that she was only his captive, but every time he tried, her calm eyes held him, stopped him from speaking harshly, and made him reconsider. Amara noticed this change. She could see the hesitation in his movements, the way he paused before giving orders, the way his voice softened slightly even when he tried to sound harsh. She knew she was making progress. She did not rush. She understood that patience was her strongest ally, and that she could guide him without forcing him to see the truth too quickly. Over the next few days, small moments of connection grew between them. Amara shared more stories about her village and her life. She told him about the festivals, the dances, and the songs that filled the air during celebrations. She spoke about the smell of fresh bread in the morning and the laughter of children playing in the mud. Slowly, Kofi began to listen without the anger that usually clouded his mind. One evening, as the sun set and the forest glowed with a golden light, Kofi asked her quietly, Do you really think I am only anger and cruelty?" Amara looked at him calmly. "No, Kofi. I see someone who has been hurt and is searching for strength in the wrong ways. Anger is only part of you. There is more." His hands shook slightly as he listened. For the first time in years, no one had questioned his anger or reminded him of what he could be. She saw the human behind the mask of cruelty he had worn for so long, and it unsettled him more than any fight ever could. The connection between them was fragile but growing. Kofi felt confused by the emotions stirring in his chest. He respected her courage, feared her intelligence, and yet, he found himself admiring her in ways he did not want to admit. Amara noticed this subtle shift. She had not intended to charm him or make him like her, She only wanted to survive and find the moment to regain her freedom. But she understood that this human connection could be used wisely. Amara also recognized that Kofi's growing admiration was dangerous for him. It could lead him to make mistakes, to lower his guard. She continued to act carefully, never showing that she fully understood how to manipulate the situation. She kept her movements small and deliberate, never rushing, never forcing him to see what she saw. She was patient, knowing that timing was crucial. As the days turned into nights, Kofi found himself thinking more about Amara than he cared to admit. He replayed their conversations, the calm way she had spoken, the sharp intelligence in her eyes. The anger he had carried for so long began to soften, replaced by a strange mixture of guilt, respect, and awe. He could not understand why a captive could have such power over him, why her simple words could unsettle him so deeply. Amara, meanwhile, kept her mind sharp and her focus steady. She noted every change in his behavior, every moment of hesitation, every sign of doubt. She understood that controlling someone's mind did not require threats or punishment. Sometimes it required quiet observation, patience, and carefully chosen words. She was planting seeds that would one day bloom into opportunity. One afternoon, Kofi sat silently by the fire, staring at the walls. Amara approached slowly, carrying a small piece of bread. She placed it near him and said softly, "Eat something. You look tired." He looked at her suspiciously. "Why do you care?" Amara shrugged slightly. "I care because you are human like me. And humans need food to survive." The simplicity of her words struck him. No one had ever spoken to him like this, with honesty, kindness, and without fear. He felt a warmth that confused him, something he could not name. He realized that she had begun to change the way he thought, the way he felt. Over the next several days they spoke more often. Kofi told small stories of his life, the village he had grown up in, the struggles of his family, the moments of loss he had endured. He spoke reluctantly at first, but Amara listened patiently, never judging, never mocking. The more he spoke, the more he realized that she was not just clever, she was wise. Her calm presence made him feel emotions he had long buried, and this frightened him more than her escape ever could. Amara understood the power of this connection. She knew that when the time came she could use it to her advantage. But she did not rush. She waited, knowing that forcing the moment too early could ruin everything. Patience and careful observation had given her insight into Kofi's mind. Now she had also begun to influence it quietly, without him realizing the full extent. By the end of the week, Kofi was no longer the man who had dragged her into the forest. Amara had been in the forest hut for several weeks now. During that time she had learned everything about Kofi's habits, the layout of the hut, and his moments of carelessness. She had observed him so closely that she could almost predict his actions before he made them. He had begun to trust her in small ways without realizing it, and she had used that trust wisely. She had watched him lower his guard, talk about small things, and even smile at stories she told. She knew the time to act was near. That night, the forest was quiet. The wind rustled softly through the tall trees, and the moon shone brightly overhead. Kofi had left the door slightly ajar, thinking no one could escape through it. He was tired after a long day, and his mind, clouded by the confusion and admiration Amara had slowly planted, was not as sharp as usual. He sat near the small fire, sharpening his tools and muttering to himself. His anger still lingered, but it was mixed now with uncertainty and fatigue. Amara waited patiently, watching him from the corner of the hut. She had noticed how he always placed the ropes in a particular order, how he moved the tools around at night, and which way he walked when he left for water. Every detail mattered. Her heart beat fast, but her mind remained clear. She had prepared carefully, and she knew she could use his own habits to her advantage. When Kofi finally leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a brief rest, Amara seized the moment. She quietly untied the rope she had been tied with, carefully not making any sound. She moved slowly, step by step, to the door. Her hands were steady, her breathing calm. She opened the door just enough to slip through, keeping her movements hidden in the shadows. Once outside, she looked back at the hut. Everything she had learned about Kofi's routine was coming into play. She moved quickly to a small pile of wood near the back of the hut, using it to prop the door shut from the outside. She pushed it firmly so the door would lock when it swung back, unaware that Kofi was still inside, slightly sleeping but in a position where he could not reach the door easily. Then she ran. The forest seemed alive with the sounds of the night, the soft rustle of leaves, the chirping of crickets, and the occasional hoot of an owl. Her feet moved quickly and silently over the soft earth. Every step was careful, but she did not hesitate. Freedom was within reach and she could almost feel it in the cool night air. Inside the hut, Kofi stirred. At first, he thought he had imagined the movement at the door, but when he opened his eyes and saw that the door would not move, panic filled him. He pulled at the ropes and kicked at the walls, shouting in anger and fear. "Amara, open the door. What have you done?" His voice echoed through the hut, bouncing off the wooden walls, but there was no response. Amara was already far enough away that she could hear him but still remain hidden. She kept moving, navigating through the forest by the light of the moon. Her heart raced, but she smiled quietly. Kofi's own carelessness, his greed and his anger had created the opportunity for her escape. It was almost ironic. The man who thought he could control her had trapped himself. Kofi's panic grew. He banged on the walls with his fists, shouting louder, calling her name. His voice was filled with desperation, a mixture of fear and regret. For the first time in his life he felt powerless. The anger that had once made him feel strong was gone, replaced by panic and shame. He realized, too late, that every choice he had made to capture Amara had led him to this point. His confidence, which had seemed unshakable, was destroyed. Meanwhile, Amara moved silently through the forest, her mind alert to every sound. She knew Kofi could follow her if he got free quickly, so she carefully avoided the paths he might take. Her knowledge of the forest, gained from watching the movements of animals and observing the trees, helped her navigate safely. She stayed calm even as she could hear Kofi shouting in the distance. As she reached a clearing, she stopped for a moment to catch her breath. She looked back toward the direction of the hut. The sound of Kofi's angry shouts still echoed faintly, but she knew he could not escape the door easily. A sense of relief washed over her. She had used her patience, intelligence, and careful observation to turn the tables. The captive had outsmarted the captor. Kofi continued to pound on the walls and doors. Each slam of his fists was a reminder of his mistakes, of the choices he had made out of anger and greed. He realized that his desire to control someone else had blinded him to the dangers of his own actions. Every moment of his life he had spent thinking of himself, thinking of revenge or power, had led him to this moment, trapped, alone, and filled with regret. Amara, now at a safe distance, allowed herself a small smile. She had escaped without violence, without confrontation, using only her mind, her patience, and her understanding of Kofi's weaknesses. She had survived the danger without harming him, though he would feel the consequences of his own actions fully. As she made her way toward the path leading back to Kibara, she thought about the lessons she had learned. Strength and courage were important, yes, but intelligence, patience, and careful observation were even more powerful. Kofi had been strong physically, but his mind had been clouded by anger, and that had made him predictable. By staying calm and observant, Amara had gained the upper hand. The night was deep and the forest seemed peaceful, but the sounds of Kofi's shouting still reminded her of the danger he represented. She did not hurry recklessly. She moved carefully, using the cover of trees and bushes to remain unseen. Each step brought her closer to safety and further from the mistakes of the man who had captured her. Finally, she reached the edge of the forest where the first lights of Kibara shone faintly. Her heart swelled with hope and relief. She had survived the night, outsmarted a dangerous man, and reclaimed her freedom. She knew Kofi would remain trapped in the hut for some time, and the forest would protect her from immediate pursuit. She allowed herself to relax slightly but remained cautious until she was safely within the village. When she reached her home, she was greeted by her family and neighbors who had been worried about her disappearance. They listened in amazement as she described her escape, her calmness, and her cleverness. They praised her bravery and intelligence. Amara knew that while her physical strength had helped her survive, it was her mind and patience that had truly saved her. Back in the forest hut, Kofi sat slumped against the wall. His anger had faded, replaced by a heavy sense of shame and regret. He realized that his greed, his poor choices, and his desire to control another person had caused his downfall. He had trapped himself, both physically in the hut and morally in the realization of his mistakes. Every moment of confidence he had carried had been replaced with panic and despair. That night, Kofi understood a truth he had ignored for many years. Cruelty and selfishness might give temporary satisfaction, but they always come with consequences. He had lived to regret his decision to take Amara captive, and the lesson was harsh and inescapable. Kofi had never felt this way before. In the small hut deep in the forest, he sat quietly, staring at the fire as the flames flickered and cast shadows across the wooden walls. Anger, which had been his constant companion for years, now mixed with something unfamiliar, confusion. He respected Amara's courage. She did not scream, did not beg, and did not try to frighten him with weakness. She faced him calmly, observing him and the hut around her as if she owned the space, even though he had brought her here and thought he controlled everything. He felt fear too, though he hated to admit it. Not fear of her strength because he knew he was stronger physically, but fear of her intelligence. Every day she showed patience, cleverness, and observation skills that he could not match. She seemed to notice everything he did, to predict his movements before he acted. The ropes he used, the small gaps in the walls, the way he placed his tools, she studied them all. Kofi realized that even his anger could not dominate a mind like hers. The strange connection he felt was even more confusing. He could not explain why he noticed small details about her presence. The way she held her hands while waiting, the calmness in her eyes even when he raised his voice, the slight smile she sometimes gave when he was not looking. These small gestures stirred emotions he had long buried: admiration, respect, and even a pang of guilt for what he had done. Amara, calm and patient, had begun to shift the balance of power subtly. She did not confront him openly, did not challenge him with words or threats. Instead, she observed quietly, spoke when necessary, and allowed her patience to make him doubt himself. Kofi, who had thought that taking her captive gave him full control, now found himself second-guessing every decision, every movement, and every thought. During the day, when Kofi left briefly to fetch water or gather wood, Amara would watch the door carefully, noting the positions of objects and any weaknesses in the structure of the hut. She was careful to make no noise, leaving no trace of her movement, but every observation she made strengthened her understanding of the situation. Kofi's own habits, the way he underestimated her, had given her the advantage she needed. At night the tension was different. They would sit near the fire, each aware of the other, neither speaking much. Kofi found himself thinking about her, replaying her words in his mind. She had told small stories about her village, about her family, and about the peaceful life she had before being captured. He realized he could not remember the last time someone had spoken to him with such honesty and calmness, without fear, without anger, without trying to manipulate him. Amara understood the effect she had on him, but she was careful. She never acted on this understanding directly. She did not seek to manipulate his emotions fully, she only used it subtly, planting small doubts and encouraging reflection without forcing him to see her as anything more than a captive he could control. That patience and careful approach had already changed the dynamic. The captive was no longer powerless. She had become the one who understood the balance of power better than the captor. Kofi tried to maintain his authority, but it was no longer simple. He would order her to sit, to remain quiet, to do small tasks, but each command now came with hesitation. He found himself watching her carefully, trying to gauge her intentions, and even then he could not be sure what she was thinking. The confidence he had relied on for years had begun to slip. Amara noticed his uncertainty and remained calm. She continued to observe every small movement, every change in his expressions. She understood his moods and how to act in each moment. Sometimes she would answer his questions quietly, sometimes she would simply wait, giving him no reason to believe she could act against him yet. Each day her patience and intelligence made him more restless. One evening, as the sun set and the forest outside the hut glowed in the golden light, Kofi finally spoke, almost as if he were confessing something to himself. "Why do you not fear me?" he asked quietly. His voice lacked its usual harshness. There was genuine curiosity and confusion in his tone. Amara looked at him steadily. "Fear is not always necessary," she said softly. "Courage and intelligence are stronger than fear, and they can survive even when the world is harsh." Her words struck him and he could not look away. For the first time he realized that anger alone had never given him strength. It had only given him control over those weaker than him. Amara's calm courage, her careful observation, and her quiet patience had shown him a type of strength he had never known. He felt a strange mix of respect and fear, admiration and guilt. The connection between them grew slowly. It was not a friendship, not yet, and certainly not trust in the usual sense. But it was a bond of recognition. Kofi recognized her strength and intelligence, and she recognized his vulnerability and human flaws. Each knew more about the other than either had expected. The captive was learning the patterns of the captor, and the captor was slowly realizing that his anger and cruelty were not enough to dominate someone truly clever. During the days that followed, Kofi found himself thinking more about her than he wanted to. He replayed conversations in his mind, remembering the way she had spoken and the calm determination in her eyes. He felt fear that he could not explain, fear of being outsmarted, fear of failing, fear of realizing too late that his actions had consequences he could not undo. His anger, which had always been his shield, now made him restless and unsure. Amara, meanwhile, continued to strengthen her understanding of the situation. She observed the small cracks in the walls, the patterns of his movement, the times when he was careless. Every detail she noticed could one day become her path to freedom. She also understood the importance of patience. Acting too soon could be dangerous. Acting too late could waste her advantage. She balanced caution with observation, intelligence with calmness. Kofi began to notice small things about himself too. He realized that he was thinking more about Amara than about his original goals. His anger, which had driven him to capture her, had less power over his thoughts now. Instead, admiration and guilt filled the space his anger had occupied. He began to question not only his actions toward her but also the way he had treated others in his life. The balance of power had shifted, though Kofi did not fully understand it. He still had physical control of the hut and the ropes, but he lacked the clarity, patience, and intelligence that Amara displayed every day. She had learned the patterns, predicted his moves, and gained insight into his mind. The captor had the tools, but the captive had the understanding. Every night, when Kofi fell into restless sleep, Amara would lie quietly thinking about her plan. She did not rush, she did not force herself to act yet. She understood that strength came not only from courage but from timing and intelligence. She had created a subtle advantage that could be used when the moment was right. Kofi, on the other hand, could not rest. He tossed and turned, thinking of her, thinking of his choices, thinking of the strange connection that made him doubt himself. He had once believed anger and control were all-powerful, but he was beginning to see that they were fragile. Amara's calm patience, intelligence, and courage had shown him a type of power he could not overpower with brute force. By the end of the week, the hut was a place of silent tension. Kofi still controlled the physical space, but he no longer controlled the mind. Amara's influence, though subtle, was undeniable. The captive had learned more about the balance of power than the captor had ever realized. Kofi's confidence had been shaken. His anger had lost its sharp edge. His decisions were now clouded by doubt and respect for a woman he had thought he could dominate. Amara understood the final truth. Victory did not always come from confrontation. Sometimes, it came from patience, observation, and understanding the mind of the other. She had survived, she had influenced, and she had prepared the ground for what would come next. The balance of power was no longer in Kofi's favor, even though he still held the tools of control. The captive had become the one who truly understood how to win. And so, night after night, day after day, the quiet tension continued. Kofi, restless and confused, and Amara, calm and patient, had created a new dynamic. The anger and control that had seemed absolute at first now had limits. The captor had begun to regret his decisions, though he did not fully realize why. The captive had gained understanding, patience, and power in ways that could not be taken away.